listeners, and welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. I'm Alex Sargent.
And I'm Chris Holliday.
Chris, today we're doing a film that I've wanted to do on the podcast for a while, but it's a classic one of those, how do we do it and in what capacity? The film is Michel Ocelot's Kirikou and the Sorceress. And wow, it's a film that sort of loomed large in our thinking. It's a film that we've always thought we should do at some point, but it's a film that I'm a little bit intimidated to even start with. I had seen it before today's recording, and I'd re-watched it in advance, and it's really rich and really dense, and there's lots of fun things we might say. I kind of don't even want to say all my notes and summarize them yet, because there's so much different things around fantasy that we could touch on, and others that we probably won't because we won't have time, that I'm just excited to kind of unpack it with you. How about you?
Yeah. No, yes, it won't surprise listeners to know that I'd not seen the film beforehand. So this was not a rewatch, but a watch. And Ocelot is somebody who I don't really think we've thought about Ocelot. We've never done him on the podcast. We haven't really mentioned Ocelot. We've done a few sort of French animations, and I'd like to sort of anchor maybe the film within the context of French animation history. But yeah, really rich, sort of don't really know where to start. And so my notes are just, I was sort of watching it rather than making notes. I was like, this is one. So I'm sort of a bit overwhelmed by the film. So I'm excited to dig into it, because I'm not quite sure. Just as the film, I'm not quite sure where this is going to go. So yeah, cool. Excited.
Look, thank God we've got someone to help us then. So obviously we've got a very special guest on the podcast today, Professor Louis Seifert, who's Professor of French and Francophone Studies at Brown University. Louis's research interests capture a number of key words and key topics of interest that's going to help us unpack Kirikou, from French literature and culture, folklore and fairy tales, my kind of guy, gender and sexuality, environmental humanities, and he's published on Ocelot, as well as the place of anthropomorphism in Francophone fairy tales, Francophone, West African and Caribbean folklore, which I think is going to play a role in this discussion. And he's got an upcoming book that he's working on at the moment on tricksters in Francophone oral narratives, of which I think Kirikou might have some interesting things to say about, and we interesting things to say in return. So, Louis, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure.
Help us, Louis. Let's get unpacking of this thing. Can you talk to us, perhaps as a way of easing ourselves into this conversation, about your interest in the movie? When did you first see it? What's your relationship with it? You've published on it. It fits your research interests. Let's get us going nice and slowly and see where on earth we can get with this.
I became interested in it. I'd seen it, but I became interested in it in the context of a course I was teaching on folk and fairy tales in the Francophone world. So in France, in North Africa, West Africa, the French Caribbean, and in North America, because I like to integrate both written texts and films. And this film, I think it's fairly well known in the English-speaking world, although there are some reasons why it wasn't more widely released, especially in the United States. And we can talk about that in a little bit. But it is iconic in France and in French-speaking Africa. It's a very important film, not without controversy, but it remains a staple of animation for children. And for West Africans, I think the audience is probably even beyond that. And so I felt it was really incumbent upon me to include this in the course I was teaching. And then, because of my own research interests in the ways that oral narratives become adapted both in film and in literature, I was interested in this particular film. Ocelot himself grew up in Equatorial Guinea. His parents were colonial school teachers. So I think he's in his early 80s now. So he knew Africa in the time of the last years of the colonial presence. And he says that he knew a version of this story from some textbooks that were given to school children in West Africa. And that really prompted his desire to make this film. He talks about the process of adaptation, and he takes many, many liberties. In fact, the story itself is only in the very initial scenes, bears much resemblance to the folktale that was recorded in the early 20th century. And from there, he really takes it to very different places. He includes some of the staples of folkloric narrative. But one of the things that is really, really fascinating with Ocelot, and beyond this film, is the way that he plays with those expected structures and conventions of folk tales and fairy tales. And so that also fascinated me.
Okay, so I think there are two avenues we're going to have to explore in this conversation to do any kind of justice to a movie that probably can't be done justice to in an hour's conversation. But I'm interested in I guess the aesthetic richness of what you're talking about. For people who've not seen it, it's a movie that feels very folkloric without necessarily kind of drawing on being any kind of strict adaptation of a particular folklore. It's a movie that I'm sure Chris is going to have a field day with in terms of its future influences, both in French animation, but also actually kind of, I was doing a checklist of things like Moana and Pan's Labyrinth and these kind of movies that I thought were original, but apparently they've just seen Kirikou, and things like that. So there's all that we can unpack. There's also the kind of contested or the issue of the kind of, how much is in alliance and how much it's in tension with the messiness of the kind of post-colonial message of the movie, which I'm sure we will get to. Should we start with the film itself, maybe, and we'll get into the kind of the story behind the scenes first? Now, listeners know this. I only really ask guests to summarize the movie if I think I can't really summarize the movie. So I'm admitting I'm not sure I can summarize the plot of Kirikou easily. Do you want to have a go for us? Have you done this before?
I can have a go. I mean, I don't want to perhaps get too
give us the tagline.
So it's the story of this extraordinary infant who is born almost miraculously. I mean, he speaks to his mother from the womb, and she says, well, if you can talk, then you're going to have to birth yourself. And he immediately sets out to save his village, which has been the curse of a sorceress. And he basically saves first his uncle, who has set out to defeat this sorceress, then the children of the village twice, and then finally the village itself by restoring their water. After that, he wants to go and see his grandfather, who is this mysterious sage who lives deep in a mountain on the other side of the sorceress's hut. His grandfather, that's a really key scene, by the way. I think the moment when he speaks with his grandfather, and he's a very inquisitive little boy. Besides being highly intelligent, he is asking why things are the way they are, and that, I think, is one of the key messages of the film. Philosophically, if you want to say, one of the interesting points of this film. So he asks his grandfather, first of all, why Kahaba, the sorceress, is the way she is, and then what he can do to rectify that situation. And he finds out that there is some evil men had implanted a spike in her back, and that would have to be extracted. After speaking with his grandfather, goes to draw Kahaba, the sorceress, out of her hut. He finds a way to pull the spike or the thorn out of her back, and then she herself is transformed. And she says that this is a liberating moment. She is free. She's free from the burden of being this sorceress. And he then, as a little boy, falls in love with her and asks to marry her. And she says, well, no, you're too young for me to marry me. But he asks her to kiss him. She kisses him. And but then becomes an adult Kirikou. And then they fall in love. They return to the village. The villagers are initially very hostile for them and very suspicious. But the grandfather returns with the men of the village who had been transformed into robots. So that's one.
So anyone listening, yes, there are robots in this movie.
Right. There's lots of things that are. But anyway, with the return of the grandfather and the men who had been transformed into robots by the sorceress, there is a happy ending, and Kirikou and Kahaba, the sorceress, are welcomed back into the village. So
Yeah, very good, very
I,
good.
I tried my best.
No, that's great. And actually, I think you captured a spirit of the movie that I'm very interested in time in animation.
Uh-huh.
I'm very interested in time in all kind of forms of storytelling, and I think there's been some wonderful work on the fantastic and the
Mhm.
fantastic's role as a kind of disruptor of kind of ideas of time. And I'm always interested in the podcast on animation, because it seems to me animation as a medium is kind of, there's something inherent in the tension of it, of this, like, you know, the very nature of what animation is. Christopher's looking at me now with a certain what's he about to say, of this kind of, you know, the removal of labor in return for the spectacle of kind of forward momentum, right? This kind of movement exchange for labor in this kind of linearity thing, you know, like
Way to put it,
there's
yeah.
this, yeah. So there's a certain kind of, I don't know, forward momentum, very kind of, you know, Western kind of versions of time progression. And what I love about fairy tales and this kind of version of the fairy tale is that, yes, there's this kind of overarching narrative that you did so well to narrativize there, but even in your narration, you're saying words like, and then this happens, and then they go over there for a bit, and there's this kind of episodic willful disruption of this kind of through line A, B, C, D, E kind of narrative structure. And it starts right at the beginning, right, where we have this, I think the first line of the film, or if it's not the first line, it's one of the first lines, mother, bring me into the world. So it's this kind of really confusingly cyclical kind of order from the yet born Kirikou, who already knows that he needs to be brought into the world, that he's already kind of in the world because he's having a conversation with his mother, and yet isn't in the world yet. And there's that kind of wonderful messiness of time, for want of a better word, in the movie, and that's part of the folkloric appeal. There's all these little vignettes and adventures that he goes on.
Sure.
And I like that as a because when you talk about obviously animation is inherently a time-based medium, because of course it relies on certain understandings of editing and the illusion of movement and the illusion of life to tell a story, and of course each frame and all this sort of stuff. But obviously the process of animation in and of itself, that takes time, is itself an interrogation of time, because animation is about how to interrogate and think about kind of pauses and gaps and spaces. And it makes me think of my first note, which is about the use of staging and movements from left to right, and then going back and thinking about animation's historical relationship to comic books. And obviously comic books have a particular way of thinking about time and the gutter that exists between the panels and all that sort of stuff. And then obviously when animation then takes over, and lots of early animated characters are themselves comic book characters that now move in different ways, and Felix the Cat moves left to right, and we can talk about Felix the Cat and Tricksters in a while. But obviously part of animation staging is that it has to interrogate quite reflexively time. So the illusion of life is created through the rapid editing together of images, as it is in lots and lots of forms of illusion. Cinema and is a time-based medium, of course. But the idea of things like time in relation to motion and action and staging are all actively interrogated by virtue of animation sort of rhetorical form. So yeah, I like that as a sort of that conversation that Kirikou has at the start with his mother about being able to walk, and then being able to speak, and then able to walk. Je m'appelle Kirikou. That's one of the first things that he says. And then I thought, yeah, the staging of the movement from left to right. Oh, this is a kind of interesting play with, yeah, thinking about time and movement and staging, and that was all wrapped up in sort of the first couple of minutes. So yeah, I quite like that looping of a conversation between something that's not yet born, but is aware that he needs to be birthed in order to sort of it's very simondant. It's very like crystallized, you know, be created and actuated. So yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that happens at the very beginning of the opening scenes. So it really plants the seed from very beginning.
I'm tempted to start trying to map onto this, because there's all kinds of allegorical and figurative readings we can throw at this, particularly with the kind of the various lenses that you're setting up. But we've got this kind of central dynamic of this kind of magical child who is beyond, or wise beyond his years, or at the very least wise beyond anyone's expectations, and this battle with this sorceress who It's interesting, isn't it? Because like I think there's something like when I was rewatching the movie, I was tempted to like is the sorceress a kind of metaphor for a sort of an imperialistic force? And I think there are ways in which the film asks us to read that. I mean, I'm very struck by is it the term so she turns these people into these kind of robots that do her bidding, and then they
Right.
kind of spy on them for her. And there's the gaze of fetish or something like that. There's this idea that sort of that they're no longer looking at the world, they're fetishizing the world as part of a kind of evil doing. So there's clearly something going on around kind of one force oppressing another force through kind of quite colonialist issues. But then we've got that narrative wrinkle of her being a woman, so obviously this is a feminized colonizer, and you've got that kind of sting at the end of the tale of this kind of actually she's redeemed and marries Kirikou. So I don't know what do we do with all of that?
What do we do? That's good. I mean, because I think the reading of seeing her as a colonizer or a symbol of an imperial force works until you get to the end, unless we see the end as sort of a utopian fast forward into a different relation to the post-colonial world. I don't know if I would see her as a colonizer. It's very complex, and I think there are multiple layers of this. There is a very brief moment in the conversation with Kirikou's grandfather where you have these scenes, very vague scenes of men with knives in hands when they put the thorn into her back, which seemed almost to suggest a scene of rape, or it's certainly violence. So she herself is victimized, and the evil that she is doing is a result of this initial victimization. It might be possible, if one wanted to drill down a little bit, to say that she becomes an image of the indigenous populations who are working collaboratively with colonizer, and that they can be redeemed. That might be one way of reading her. I wanted to return to one thing you said about Kirikou that I think is interesting. You called him a magical figure, and he's certainly not a mortal in the ordinary sense of the world. But I don't think that his power necessarily stems from magic per se. He is, as I said, not realistic in the way that he comes to work, but the things that he does stem from his own intelligence, his extraordinary intelligence, and the question of what is magic is something that gets debated in the film. It is true that Karabakh has magical powers. At the same time, the grandfather tells him that the villagers are exaggerating her powers, that they are attributing things to her that she cannot do. For instance, she does not eat the men, as they claim. She has not cast a spell on the spring that provides the villagers water, as they assumed. It was an animal that had found its way into the tunnel and had engorged and blocked the water. So that is an interesting question that is raised by the film. What is the status of magic, and what is the role of people themselves in attributing magical force to figures that don't have as much power as they assume?
Yeah.
So anyway, I veered off from
No.
part of your question.
No, I had So I suppose tying some of this stuff together, I had a lot of notes. I think I align with you, Lewis, in terms of the positioning of, and I think that the end, the sort of the reading that works, and up until the end where the thorn is removed, I was thinking about kind of shame and violence and revenge and the kind of rape of the sorceress. Absolutely thinking about disassociation and trauma and the impact of that on the sort of on the body, and then I was thinking about the role of animation in this, and that maybe that the animation in some ways flattens this this treatment of magic and the idea of what we're supposed to take as magic within the world of the film, and what is just the film showing us in the best way possible. And so there are moments where that kind of discourse of exaggeration, where you're absolutely right that the sort of local community is sort of making up, it's kind of printing the legends, it's making up these myths in and around the sorceress and all the things that she has supposedly done. And then there's the community's view of those things, and then there's the film's view of those things. And there are moments where it's sort of being dramatized through the animation, and I was trying to figure out, is this actually what's happening, or is this a moment where the film is intervening as a way of showing us the action? This is the best way that Kirikou's tunneling through it's going to show us it like this. And so I was just trying to make sense of the role of the animation in precisely complicating what we are able to discern as magical behavior, and what are we able to discern as a quality of the aesthetics of the film that create a magical effect for us. And that was a strange, because I think tonally what I really liked about it is that the film was funny and harrowing in really dramatic shifts. So there's a sort of, I think there's a scene like the kind of earlier comedy cut to when Kirikou drowns. There's this kind of weird celebration of water at the same time as Kirikou is sort of drowned, and it was that juxtaposition I thought was really interesting, because it maps onto several moments in the film. But yeah, I think I'm interested in the role of animation, in flattening some of this, and what does that mean for how the challenge that maybe animation poses for us to be able to read the level of magic in the film based on what you said. Yeah, I don't know if that makes any sense.
It's interesting. I mean, you're more qualified to talk about the animation than I am, but it's all of Ocelot's films are very, very visually appealing, and he very experimental. In some of his earliest films, he uses silhouette shadow animation. So we just see these figures, sometimes with very elaborate backgrounds, but the human or animal figures themselves are just these silhouette cutouts on the screen. And we see some of that in this film, is in those scenes, especially you alluded to, of the underground tunneling. The status of the characters themselves, the human characters, and the animation itself of those figures, contrasted with the very luxuriant backgrounds, very detailed, is something that's always fascinated me as well. Sort of the status of the non-human juxtaposed against the human is one that I find very compelling in this film and in other films by Ocelot.
Yeah, right, because elsewhere in the film, or if we're going to kind of analyze or summarize the aesthetic of the film, that there are moments that are quote unquote hyper realist, that there are and then there are these moments, these leanings into expressivity, as you said, this kind of more experimental moments where the staging slightly changes, and the way that the sequence is articulated is graphically is somewhat at odds, not in a disruptive way. And I'm reminded that Mark Langer has written an article about Disney animation, and sort of says that Disney animation of the 30s and 40s is assumed to be this quite formulaic way of seeing the world. And then there are moments like the pink elephant sequence in Dumbo, where things just kind of go, like the film becomes inebriated, and you suddenly plays with, and I think Richard Dye used to teach that sequence as a sort of way of thinking about the frame, and even Princess and the Frog, where some of the musical numbers become entirely disconnected from the work. And here there were scenes that really challenge that realist sort of agenda. The film is very realist in lots and lots of ways, but then in other ways, some of the staging, some of the way that it uses color, especially the tunneling scene, there are a few others where it's sort of side on and positioned quite unnaturally, actually, within the diegesis. And I thought, this is a really interesting way of thinking about animated space and kind of staging. And then I wanted to kind of course correct myself, and then maybe think, well, I don't want to read too much into this, because I think the danger with and I know that the film's been written about in terms of kind of orientalist readings of the film, that the reason that the way the things are in the film is because it's non-Disney or it's non-Western, or but I thought the playing with space and I've written hyper-realist style is complemented with these really, really interesting moments of sort of reconfiguration of space, specifically the tunneling sequence. So I quite difficult to articulate the visual quality of the film, because it does balance these more hyper realist moments with, exactly as you say, these more experimental maybe moments that gesture perhaps to the director's history with that kind of silhouette, that shadow play and surface play of silhouette animation.
I've got some extremely half-baked thoughts on magic that I've been putting in the oven whilst you guys have been chatting here. So bear with me, but I think there might be something. I think you're right to pull me up on the magic term, because I think your descriptions, both of you so far, I completely agree with. So I've just been jotting down some key words that some of you have been saying, and I wonder if there's something about magic's relationship to power, and how some of this bears out in relation to that, in the sense that, so magic is odd, right? In that magic signals some kind of power, but it's a power not necessarily belonging to the world, or at least not in kind of literatures of fantasy, right? It's something that is beyond the world's capacities. But it also, like magical talisman in like folklore, belong very much to the world, and it's humans, or the figure of the magical being, the supernatural being, as kind of Todorov would said, that is this kind of emblematic of power. So magic can kind of bestow power onto people, but it can also kind of take power away for people. And there's quite a lot of tropes, harmful kind of racial tropes, where minorities that are considered non-normal are made magical, partly as a way of attempting to kind of speak to them in positive terms, but actually kind of in quite demeaning. And we can imagine magical Negroes and magical, these kind of tropes of kind of US literature and things like that. But we can't imagine just kind of normal people with agency. So I think when that applies to Kirikou, that makes a lot of sense, because actually you don't want Kirikou to be magical, because you want Kirikou's power to come from human agency. And there's a lot on that, right? In that, like, as they say, we're back to that right at the beginning. This is a child who can bring himself into the world. He doesn't even actually seem to need to rely on his mother to bring himself into the world. There's bits, as he's growing up very quickly, where he's like, wash me, and someone's like, wash yourself, so very much like, so there's this kind of, Kirikou's power is almost a sort of extra human agency given to him at the point of childhood. So I think that works well. And I think perhaps the animation, therefore, is doing an interesting job, when you said that, Chris, that word flattening.
Yep.
Of kind of trying to play with which characters are magical in a way that kind of ostracizes them from a community, and which characters are of this world, even if the world itself looks a bit strange and is over stylized and things like that. I don't think I can say any more sentences and make that any more coherent, I'm afraid. So you're going to have to do with that with what you've got. But I definitely think there's something about different types of magic, different types of power, and the way the animation is kind of encouraging us to see some as, for example, the sorceress is all powerful, but also completely ostracized from the world that she's in.
I think it's what Lewis, you were saying about how again, this back to this kind of mythologizing of how the sorceress's magic works or doesn't work, and how maybe over time that has become distorted, perhaps, that the legend has become distorted. And I think it was the scene, my notes were pretty standard, and then I had to write down sci-fi the minute the robots sort of torched the community's building, like the kind of jets. And I was thinking that was the moment where I thought, I wonder if this is actually happening, or whether the film is now adopting the perspective of the community, and this is how they're seeing this violent act. They're seeing it, so I was trying to wrestle with this all of the time in a film that's quite interested in perspective, because it gives us the child's perspective before anything else. I think there's one moment where there's a kind of flashback scene where a story's being, I can't remember, it might be the discussion with the grandfather, I can't remember, but there's a kind of brief jump back, and the image is slightly different because it has a black frame.
Yes, I think it's the moment where Karabakh is attacked by the men.
Right.
It's a few seconds.
Yeah,
it's black with a red background, and then their hands hovering over her. We don't see what happens, but we get the idea that she has been attacked. Yeah.
So these moments of expressivity are obviously there for narrative drama and to tell a story, and of course animation can tell it however it wants. Because of that, I was thinking about these different is this a a metaphorical way, or is the film leaning into animation's capability for sort of metaphor and allegory and symbolism, and to sort of say this is how it's more sensorial, this is how it feels like, this is how the story's being told. And there was something about, I think, the sequence of the burning, where I thought, oh, I wonder whether this is actually how we're reading this, and the robots and I put West African folktales plus fantasy plus sci-fi. But or is this just in a film that's interested in stories, this is sort of almost this is a distortion because it's being taken from the perspective of the community. So again, I think that's sort of what Alex was saying. The stylization within the film itself really makes it difficult to discern whether this is the actual action or whether this is a metaphorical interpretation through symbols of narrative acts.
I think that's very interesting. I think if you look at the film sort of retrospectively from the explanations that the grandfather gives, which are demystifying, one could look back at that scene and say, okay, we see this strange creature that seems to torch the hut. That happens very quickly. And then what the scene really concentrates on is the hut itself burning down. So I'm fascinated by those perspectives and that ambiguity that the film introduces, which is interesting when you think about fairy tale animation, because animation itself as a medium is perfectly suited for fairy tales. I think of the scholar's name, I'm afraid, I'm sorry, it has escaped me. There's a wonderful, I think it's Marvelous Geometries. Anyway,
yes, that is
a South African scholar who's done wonderful work on the
I'm
how
Googling it, lads.
Thank you.
I've cited it many times and I can't remember.
Right. Yes, I know. It's one of those senior moments I'm having. But anyway, she really shows how animation itself as a form is perhaps the best expression, because it gives freedom for both space, time, which we mentioned, and for giving in a visual medium an expression of magical moments and the like. One other thing that intrigues me in the film, and I was thinking about it as I rewatched the film before our conversation, was the status of the magic attributed to Karaba, the sorceress. After she is transformed, she retains a measure of magic. She's able to transform Kirikou into an adult state. And so that leaves open the question, is she going to retain this magic going forward? So the magic itself, yes, is attributed mostly to her, and Kirikou himself does not have a magical way of countering bad magic with good magic. He asks the grandfather for a charm so that he can combat Karaba, and he says no. The grandfather says, you have to rely on your innocence and your intelligence. That is how you will disempower her. But she's ultimately, on the other side of her transformation, not completely disempowered. So, and I'm not quite sure what to do about that. And I wondered if you had thought about that or had thought.
I don't know what to do about the idea of, I'd forgotten he said that exact question, but I have a similar thing written down, which is that you must use a mixture of your innocence and your intelligence. Because that gets us into all kinds of interesting discourses, doesn't it? About kind of, so-called innocence. Children have innocence. So-called native people have innocence. These kind of, slightly demeaning registers of innocence. But then, like, the way Kirikou, like Kirikou's question, he asks the sorceress, why are you mean and evil? And that question kind of embodies that exactly what his grandfather's talking about, right? Is that, one, there's a childlike kind of register, the kind of tautology of mean and evil. But two, the act of asking the question shows a level of kind of critical inquiry that's really necessary. So it is that kind of, it's that when children ask questions that adults don't ask because they're socialized not to, but actually are really quite profound, intelligent questions. But I'm not quite sure what one does either with that idea of, like, how do we be like Kirikou? Do we unlearn stuff? Is it about kind of never learning it in the first? I'm a little bit queasy about the idea of us all getting more innocent. I think that has some problems to it. But the film definitely kind of rewards this kind of odd paradox of innocence and intelligence mixed together.
It's true, and I wonder really if the film is coherent about the question of innocence, because I think that as he goes along, and there's sort of a Bildungsroman quality to the film,
Yeah.
he becomes less innocent. There's one moment too where I don't know if it's during the conversation with the grandfather, but Kirikou asks, "Why are some people so bad?" Basically, that's
Yeah.
what he asks, and then he concludes or he answers on question by saying, "Well, we have to be cautious. We have to watch out for what other people are going to say." So, innocence in the sense of sort of a moral purity or innocence in the sense of a naivete, I sort of wonder. And then can we say that everything he does really corresponds to that sort of an ethical
Sure.
framework? Um,
Yeah, I guess what he's not saying, it's not Blake, is it? It's not William Blake, kind of the parallel between innocence and experience. It's
right.
innocence and intelligence. So there
Yes.
seems to be something in
Yeah.
that, and I'm not sure I love this about the film, but there's something about that kind of like, that kind of slightly Western individualistic kind of trusting your gut kind of mentality,
Yeah.
right? You
Yeah.
should
Mhm.
the problem is being socialized, or what the world does to you,
Mm.
but these kind of plucky individuals. But then again, I agree with the lack of consistency, because then I don't think the film is interested in community, and like it's interested in community at a narrative level, because it's all about saving this village,
Yes.
and the voices
Yeah.
of the village are really important. It's also just interested in community on a kind of like aesthetic level. I mean, the film is rich with kind of folk music and soundscapes of wildlife and people talking and chattering, and there's always a sense of like 8 characters standing to the left and the right of the frame whilst things are happening. So yeah, I don't think that quite bears out to either.
Right. Well, I think that the emphasis on community is something that's very important and actually is very central to African folklore, West African folklore. The status of the individual has a meaning only insofar as the individual is part of a broader community. So everything that the individual does, I can't say that this is true of every single folktale, but many folktales in West Africa, it's true. It's not the individual who strikes it out and goes to get rich for him or herself. It's the values of the community that are withheld, and that's something that I think that Ocelot does a fairly good job of illustrating in his films.
Well, I was going to ask, is it about community? Because it seems like this is well, if it's about community, then it's about a community in struggle or caught in tension, or and that theme of sort of dissociation, which begins in that
Mhm.
first scene of baby from mother, is about individual versus and community, and innocence and intelligence, and it's a community that has lots of people in it, but is it a community, or is it about the struggle for community against these kind of forces? And there are moments of collaboration. So the dance after the water is the community is reunited with the water, because the animal is sort of punctured, that's drinking all the water, which is then undercut by these sort of scenes of drowning. So it almost feels like this is about individual stories within a community. So therefore, is it a film about community, or is it about I don't mean this in a bad way. I think it was quite an interesting treatment of of individual experiences within a community, and you have at the very end, obviously, all the women being reunited with the men. But
Yeah.
perhaps it was about community insofar as it was about the struggle of community, and about the tensions within a community, and about solidarity and the challenge of solidarity, or the impact of individual action. And they all band together really quickly when they don't believe that is actually one, that Sorceress has lost her powers, but also that is in fact an aged Kirikou. So it seemed like that ambiguity that you mentioned earlier kind of extends to the role of community. I think there are images of community, or there are images of lots of people in a community, but it felt quite ambiguous. I think, for me anyway, not in a bad way, but just it wasn't a kind of a community of harmony, which makes it was a community going through trauma. I think that's what it was.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think that it's good to nuance the understanding of the role of community in this film. I think on a very basic level, that what he is doing with Kirikou and the relation to the village is interesting insofar as he could have just focused on Kirikou striking out into nature, leaving the community, and seeking to benefit himself, which is a fairly frequent folkloric structure. But Kirikou is working on behalf of that community. Now, what is that behalf of, and what is the status of that community? But the fact that he retained that element of African and West African folklore specific, I think, is noteworthy. But I would agree with you that one, if you go a little bit further, then there are other questions that one could certainly ask.
I'd like just to unpick one more thing, kind of while we're still kind of concentrating on the form of the movie, because I'm conscious that I just like, you know, your comment, Lewis, about sort of different tropes of West African folklore and how that bears out in the movie.
Right.
I think I'd love to hear if there's more of them. I should say before we do that, because I said I'd Google it earlier and then we got sidetracked by various definitions of magic and the idea of community. Jessica Tiffin's marvelous geometry,
Yes.
narrative, and metafiction.
Yes, it's an
in
excellent
fairy tale
study.
So,
Excellent study. Yeah.
So there, a plug for Jessica as a recompense for forgetting her name briefly. But yes, where else is this bearing out in the movie? Where else can we see traces of African folklore? And then maybe once we've done this, we can start to talk about Ocelot and the kind of the reception of the movie.
I think it's actually more visually than diegetically, which is interesting.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I return to the scenes of the village life, the quest, of course, but that's not specific to African folklore at all. But in fact, there's several quests. You have the quest to save his uncle, the children, the water.
Yeah, there's a whole thing about a water monster for about 10 minutes.
Sort of, right. It's a little waterlogged at that moment. So, I mean, retrospectively, we understand what's happening here. But it's especially, I think, noteworthy in the ways that it departs from the actual tale that Ocelot cites as being the source of inspiration, has Kirikou killing the sorceress. And here we have something very, very different. The figure of the grandfather in the mountain, for instance, I don't know where he got that, but the grandfather himself looks almost Egyptian.
Yeah.
Students regularly speculate about, what Ocelot is trying to do there. I'm not quite sure.
I'd be very interesting to hear what you know about the reception of this movie, because other than what's available on the general resources of the internet, I know nothing about that with any nuance. One assumes that the reception of it in 1998 the film came out?
Yes.
Versus what the reception might be in, well, like all things, coming up to, I can't even do the maths. Is it 20 or 30 years later? Yeah, 30, right, yeah, fine. 30 years later, like everything is going to change, but I can imagine particularly the kind of the politics of authorship. Certainly, I think over those 30 years, there's been a bit of a cultural shift in terms of more heightened thought of which stories belong to who can tell other people's stories, the license to tell other people's stories, all these kind of things. So I wondered if you could, Lewis, maybe this is not a question you're able to answer, but is there a sense of what the reception was, I guess, in Europe, but also in Africa, and has that changed at all over the sort of the last 30 years?
I think it's complicated because I think
I thought it might be.
Exactly. In the French-speaking world, I would say that it remains, or it's become a classic,
Right.
Not without some questions about the status of Ocelot, a white Frenchman appropriating African folklore. The film itself has become a classic, as I said, in West Africa. And Ocelot, to his credit, did make an effort to include musicians and other actors from West Africa into the production of the film. Although that, again, is not without controversy. At one point, he was interested in having a young boy play the part of, or speak the role of Kirikou, but he said that the boy didn't have as much of an African accent, so he looked for someone else. And that came to light later and sort of raised the issue. Curiously, I'm not sure of the case in the UK, but in the US, the film itself could not be widely distributed because of the depiction of women's breasts.
Yep.
And the naked children. So it was nudity. became a problem, and even to this day prevents it from being widely distributed on Netflix, for instance. And that was the hang up and the question. That issue was not raised as much in France, although there were some people and some African scholars and critics who raised it not in terms of nudity per se, but in the term of their depiction of a certain primitive African culture that they were looking to get away from, and that they saw as reinforcing stereotypes, Western stereotypes of the post-colonial world. But I have to say that it's a question that's raised among academics more than it's raised among journalists and critics more generally.
Okay.
They might allude to it, but then they go on to talk about the animation and the popularity of the film.
Yeah, I've done it. I mean, I've done some kind of cursory, because I was thinking about, I know Richard Newport's work on French animation history and his book French animation history, and I thought, I wonder where the film
Yeah.
sits in relation to how people talk about the film, given that it's late 1990s and some of the other stuff that was happening within animation in the late 1990s, and Richard's work has a kind of extended passage on the film that actually talks about it, I guess, from the behind the scene, like the kind of idea of funding and co-production. He says that the film, quote, proved instructive and inspiring on many levels for European animators, in part because it provided a new blueprint for a viable option in international co-productions that nonetheless maintained a personal style. Talks a little bit about the kind of music and where the animation was produced. And then strangely, there's a review of Richard Newport's book, French Animation History, by Margaret Flynn, that says, critics and film historians are unanimous. The history of French animation is distinctly divided into an avant Kirikou and an après Kirikou. And all the stuff before the release of the film was limited to, quote, exceptional events. And then it's scheduled in the late 1990s against Disney's Mulan, and then a film that we've done on the podcast, Prince of Egypt, at the same time. And then after that, there's this sort of its box office success, or its contribution, French animation quadrupled. And then kind of entering animation, French animation, influencing everything from another film we've done on the podcast, Belleville Rendezvous, as well. His unexpected financial success opened the door for many other projects. So there's a really interesting, it's one of those before and after, that it's possible to speak of maybe French animation history before the film, and then afterwards, both from an aesthetic quality, but it seems from a more industrial thinking about the animation as an industrial art form, thinking about funding, co-production, release, and the BBC reports that the film is because of the nudity in the film. That's the sort of the sticking point for a re-release, and it is really difficult to find. But yeah, so I thought that was interesting that the reviewer points particularly to this before and after of this film, and the influence that the film had, I guess, domestically. More than anything else, but yeah,
I think you're absolutely right. It's a very important film from that point of view.
Yeah,
it's in some accounts of the history of French animation, it's sort of given the status of Snow White for Disney in the 1930s. I don't know if it's, well, I think it's that there's been a real renaissance, I would say, of French animation in the wake of this film. Even if the other animators have gone in very different directions, it's probably for the very material reasons that you were citing.
Yeah.
And then the experimental inspiration that I think other animators got from.
And so, I mean, one thing I was going to say is that obviously we haven't really spoken about this as it's a trilogy, is it not? That there are three.
It is.
Kirikou.
It is.
So
there are two other.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it's just, I suppose, from that perspective that yes, you're absolutely right about this Renaissance, but it's obviously a story that he wants to return to. And so I thought that was really interesting that it's that the director himself would return to these characters and kind of play with storytelling. The second film is slightly different. It's not a direct sequel. I think it's playing with time slightly differently. But we should kind of flag that this is the first of
Exactly.
a Kirikou universe, as it were, a cinematic
right.
universe.
Yeah, so the other two sequels actually return to the time before Kirikou becomes an adult, So here, talking about time is interesting. So we return to that time, and one is Kirikou and the men and the women. And so he really tackles some gender issues there on an interesting way. And then the other is Kirikou and the wild animals, and the way that Kirikou interacts with animals, none of whom I believe speak, actually. So the question of language is interesting, but he's able to articulate or to communicate in other ways, and to help these animals or to counteract the effects of these animals on the village itself. Anyway, so it is interesting. Those other films have perhaps not had as much success as the original film, but they're still interesting, I would argue.
I was going to ask a broader question then, because it sounds like, I mean, I'm an anglophone scholar to my absolute detriment. I very occasionally will dip into non-English language texts, but from listeners will know from my pronunciation skills, it would be an act of violence, probably on my part to try and do so. So, I'm asking with a lot of ignorance in the questions, but there's an interesting. When we're talking, I was trying to think of what I would compare this to in terms of other texts, and it sort of makes, particularly with its kind of colonial roots and post-colonial legacy, it reminds me somewhat of a sort of Kipling figure, right? Of a figure that is very much a product of colonialism as much as someone writing on, or someone to be studied through the lens of colonialism. So I guess my broad question I'm getting to is that there's a lot of, I know, work on sort of transnationalism, and often when I'm reading work, when it's phrased as transnationalism, we're often talking about two countries that at least historically have some sort of equatable power relations, right? So French UK transnationalism in contemporary European art cinema, fine. It's a lot harder to talk about transnationalism when we're talking about two countries or two regions that have historically inequality in terms of their power relations. So I guess, as a Francophone scholar, this is my impossible question of the week, everybody, because this is ridiculous to answer. But I'd be interested in, can you talk about, the inevitable process of cultural exchange between West Africa and France without talking about colonialism? How do you do it if you can? Should you do it even? There you go.
Those are the big questions that that France is confronted with. One thing that I mean, I'm not really answering your question, but I think it's related, would be, and I don't know the answer to this, but it would be interesting to know how children of what the French call issus de l'immigration, so who are second, third generation, well, they're French, but their parents or their ancestors were immigrants, how they received this film as opposed to how children and adults from, say, Senegal or Côte d'Ivoire receive the film. I just from sort of cursory internet exploration, I don't see much difference, but it would be interesting to put those two in dialogue to see how, especially now, they approach a film like this and how they look at it. It is true that there are animators in West Africa who have tried to do the work of adapting folklore, and sometimes in West African languages, sometimes in French, but they have never gained the sort of notoriety that Ocelot has, partially because they don't have the funding that it would take to do that. And I think it's true both in film and also in literature that writers, West African Francophone writers who make their way to France and are able to get published in France are going to be able to have the means to become better known than those who stay in West Africa. I don't know what the situation is in the Anglophone world, whether it's but France being very, very centralized, and retaining a power over the former colonies the way it does, it makes it very difficult for animators or writers from the former colonies to make it big, so to speak.
Yeah, interesting. That's an answer to a much more interesting question than the one I actually asked. So yeah, that's really interesting. But yeah, I can imagine it's difficult. Do we have any final notes on the movie before we start to wrap up, Chris?
Well, no, I've just written down puberty. In my notes, and I think that's related to this film, or whether I've just written it down. I suppose I was interested in that transformation sequence, that kind of kiss sequence, and then Kirikou transforms into a man. I mean, there's lots of behind the scenesy things I should have probably said that I was interested in, like the child's voice in animation, which I've obviously been interested in for a long time. But for me, yeah, I thought, yeah, I really like the end of the film and that reuniting between the kind of men and the women that are presumed to have been eaten. But I was thinking about kind of puberty, and I was thinking about whether or not, again, maybe this is of course what the film is about, rather than me saying maybe it was just a. But I wondered whether that transformation sequence into man, again, maybe I was just put in an uneasy viewing position, but I thought, okay, so is this actually happening, or is this a kind of visualization of an ascent to adulthood that the film is also interested in? If the film is playing with the notion of birth, why can't it? And for exactly the reason that you said, Alex, through that opening sequence, why does it matter that this is a true transformation or not? Is it really about the change in appearance from child to a young child to sort of young man? So I sort of had some ambiguity or some wonderings about that, whether or not it was actually happening, whether it matters. The effect is sort of still the same, but I was unsure. Really, I don't want to dismiss everything as just maybe it's just an interpretation of something. But it did strike me that retention by the sorceress of some degree of magic, even after what is essentially the Aesop's fable of removing the thorn from the lion's paw. I was still wondering, okay, there's a retention of magic in a way that maybe that complicates maybe some of the readings of the ending, but maybe I'm reading too much into it.
I would just add to that my students are often, especially more recent generations of students, troubled by that line. So she kisses him on the lips, although parents kiss their children on the lips. But anyway.
Yeah, no, it's interesting.
So,
Again, all this.
They're troubled. They're troubled by the age dynamic of.
I think so.
Is this a sort of weird, romantic, and then
makes
he
it
goes,
very clear. I say them sort of in defense of Ocelot and his narrative, that she makes it very clear that no, we cannot get married. You will grow up, and later you will find someone, and you will fall in love.
Yes.
He is insistent.
Yes.
But anyway,
yes.
it is true that the question of is this really happening or not I think is an interesting one, especially given the extraordinarily complex visual image. So they're in the forest, and the forest itself is transformed at the same time that she is transformed.
Yeah, the flowers open and
incredible colors.
Yeah.
And so, okay, is this really happening?
Yeah.
So all about hesitation, as I tell you so many times.
Well, it's also about time. Like all of these queries that we've got are about time in some form.
They are about time. Yeah. So we return to time.
Yeah, and of course, thinking about nature. I mean, Miyazaki is very interested. He sort of uses animation to create the illusion of time lapse when creatures and when nature is being restored and events are so that how can you animate time lapse? I'm sort of fascinated by how the digital reproduces bullet time, like the digital animated films creating animation creating itself, sort of thing. And I'm that idea of animation, drawn animation with this particular pictorial style, creating the illusion of time lapse. If a film is confused by time or is about the ambiguity of time, that's how I left the film. I thought, oh, okay, there's a play with, and maybe it's all part of trauma, isn't it? It's part of the destabilization of time and sort of wrapped up within this story of fantasy. Does it really matter? That's how I felt with the end of the film. But it's also about hesitation, yes. Alex.
Well, no. Well, speaking of time, see what I did there?
Hey.
We're nearly out of it. So, Lewis, before you go, so we teased this in the introduction, and we actually didn't get really round to talking about tricksters in in Kirikou. So by all means, mention them if you would like in your answer. But yeah, tell us a bit more about this forthcoming book project. Listeners listening now, this will be out in a few years, is it? Or a year or so?
It'll be a couple more years, right?
Yes.
Right.
So those in the future, speaking again of time,
Lucky you.
it might already be out. So Google a title like this or something close to it. But you're working on a book on tricksters in Francophone oral narratives. Tell us a little bit
Right,
about
right.
it.
So I'm interested in figures who are amoral, but also highly intelligent and who live on sort of the margins of their communities, to return on to that topic that we discussed. And I'm interested in how those figures, much folklore, but especially in West African folklore, mediate between the human and the non-human worlds, and how they seem to articulate a different way relating to nature and using natural resources. So in a very broad way. And we see a little bit of that in the film, although I think that Kirikou himself, is he really a trickster? He's not amoral, which is one of the important characteristics of a trickster. He's certainly intelligent and in an extraordinary, unrealistic way. But whether he is a trickster or not, I think he's missing that one key component. So I would like to be able to include him in this work, so one way or another, and I think I will have a chapter or part of a chapter devoted to him, but I'll have to spend a lot of time talking about why he's not really a full-blown trickster.
Awesome, terrific. And will the other examples be from sort of a history sort of across folklore and literature? Or?
Yes, I'll start with some famous figures in French folklore. Puss in Boots, for instance, is certainly a trickster. Little Thumbling, Petit Poucet in French. Actually, Petit Poucet is a figure that's a name that's often used in discussing figures like Kirikou, but who also are amoral and who do not hesitate to use violence to get their ends and to trick their opponents.
Cool, terrific. Any Anassi the spider? He says testedly
Yes,
going back to his
definitely,
PhD
definitely. Yes.
notes.
Yes.
Great.
Someone needs to do an animated film of
That'd be good.
there might be some, but I'm
Yeah.
do more work with that, because I think there's a lot of great stories that can be told, that have been told, and that could be used in film.
Terrific. Well, we look forward to reading that when it comes out. No pressure.
you.
But for now, Lewis, thanks so much for giving your time and coming on the podcast
Thank you.
about Kirikou.
It's wonderful discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, terrific. No, yeah, really enjoyed it, and we couldn't have done without you. Really helpful way of unpacking the movie. You can find us on fancy-animation.org. I don't think there's anything on Kirikou on our website, is there, Chris? But
No.
there's some stuff on French animation more broadly. We've done some stuff in the past. Check out the archive. Follow us on various social media at FanAnim Research, FANANIM Research. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.
Bye.